This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find all about it on our homepage. I am Gilad Halpern. Every week, my co-host Dalia Shendlin and I talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Dalia is away this week, and it is therefore my pleasure, and mine alone, to welcome Rabbi Hara Person, the Chief Executive of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, to the show. We are going to discuss a new book over whose publication she presided, entitled Deepening the Dialogue, American Jews and Israelis Envision the Jewish Democratic State. Rabbi Person, hello and welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much.
So the book comes on the heels of several recent attempts to account for the growing divide between Israelis and American Jews, including your own attempt, that's the CCAR, the 2018 book, The Fragile Dialogue, New Voices of Liberal Zionism. What did you set up to achieve in this very crowded neighborhood with this new book?
Well, what we wanted to do with both of these books was show a variety, a diversity of voices on this subject, to be able to give rabbis, congregations, communities, tools, resources to be able to have deep and meaningful conversations about Israel and Zionism, but not just one person's opinion. And that's, I think, the strength of both of these books, that they represent a multitude of voices.
Does it require a certain different attitude when it comes to rabbis and congregations and a setting in the synagogue and stuff like that, as opposed to any other sort of forum to discuss these issues?
Well, I think every forum is different, but that's the community, or that's the sort of audience that we most easily reach. That's our sort of primary direct audience. It's not that our books don't go elsewhere, but that's sort of our first line. And it's also our responsibility, it's our mission to be able to provide resources for those communities. And so that's when we think about how we expand the conversations with Israel, how we deepen them, how we add more nuance to the conversation, that's the first place that we aim to do it.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is done differently inside the synagogue than outside the synagogue?
Well,
in this respect, of course.
Right. It's as complicated in our synagogues today in North America as it is in other settings. I think that's really the basis for doing both of these books to begin with, that there is this sort of ever-widening divide about how we talk about Israel, and that's true inside the synagogues as well. We've gotten more and more into these very sort of entrenched camps about being pro-Israel and anti-Israel, which, I think is actually ridiculous. I think we need to get rid of those terms entirely. It doesn't help the conversation. So even within our synagogues, it's become very difficult, very complicated to have productive conversations about Israel. People very easily get into corners, start with accusations, pointing fingers, and don't listen to each other. And so this is an attempt to create a space in which we can have nuanced conversations and learn from each other, hear each other, and actually understand that there are people here in Israel, and that's part of the thing that's really important about these books, especially the second book, that we have partners here, that it's not, America versus Israel, that it's actually we're together, we share values, and we need to be working together and talking together.
Yeah. Well, the we that you're talking about are essentially, leaning to a very specific side in the Israel debate, the progressive one,
that's
right?
I mean, that's right.
Isn't it? I'm not saying that it's essentially or necessarily an internal conversation, but aren't you running the risk of missing out on the crucial debate of reaching out to the non-progressive pro-Israel crowd? Well,
that's an interesting question that actually reaches into a much larger area of the work that we do. That's something we talk about, we think about a lot. But the truth is that we are a movement that has certain values, and you can call them progressive or liberal. You could also call them Jewish, right? I don't think that they're necessary. They've sort of been labeled progressive or liberal, but I think if you actually, really look at our foundational Jewish texts, I would say that they're Jewish values. And that is a debate going on within our communities, having nothing to do with Israel, just this question of sort of, is to be involved in this, whatever the issue is that, a progressive thing, a democratic thing, or is it just a Jewish thing to be talking about? Rabbis are dealing with this a lot right now in North America. If you get up and talk about certain issues, some people are going to label you as being political. And, I really believe it's actually foundationally Jewish. So I think that's true in this issue as well. Well, put it this way, I think that we are overall a movement, as a Reform movement, that believes in certain values. And among those values are the values of democracy, things like free press, freedom of choice, freedom of opinion. And so that is true the way we live our lives as Jews in North America, and that is true in terms of how we interact with Israel.
Yeah, the interesting thing, I think, is not only that you're missing out on the less or not so progressive contingent of American Jewry, but also, it's a very different conception of Judaism to what most Israelis have. As the cliche goes, the synagogue in Israeli wouldn't set a foot in would be an Orthodox one, right? So it's just a very different conception of what seems to you so naturally, foundationally Jewish is in many cases totally foreign to Israelis.
Yeah, I actually would argue that that's less and less the case here. I think that certainly was true for a long time. But we see, even just statistically, the numbers are showing a different story today, that more and more Israelis are turning to Reform Judaism, maybe not to become lifelong members necessarily, although that would be great, but to have bar bat mitzvahs for their children, to get married, things like that. And I think that actually, the majority of Israelis are pro-democracy and they are pro-pluralism. And the Reform movement stands for those values both in North America and here.
Don't you think that there has been a certain erosion of democratic and liberal values in Israel that might affect the kind of dialogue that you're trying to instigate?
Absolutely. And I think, we're dealing with some fears about this in North America as well, to be honest. So, yeah. And
not among Jews, though,
not among Jews, but just as Americans. That's right. But I think that's part of the urgency, actually, of deepening the conversation with our Israeli sort of counterparts, if you will, and finding places of connection that based on the same values that we share both in as North American Jews and as Israelis.
It is interesting because when you look at the formula of Jewish and democratic state, we, as you said, until recently, the contentious bit was the Jewish one, but over time, the contentious bit has become the democratic one. Does it make things harder, more complicated, or easier to resolve in that sense?
Well, certainly it makes it more complicated, but I think maybe, if I'm going to be optimistic, it gives us more ground in which to have sort of shared conversation. Mm-hmm. I think it sort of helps us understand the shared danger, or the danger, in a more mutual way, that we can both recognize the kind of complicated landscape in which we're both living and how we need to be talking together about this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how do we need to talk together about this? What are really the interesting thing about the book is it really has homework at the end of every chapter, right? Two contributors, an Israeli and an American, talking about a certain issue, deriving mainly from the Declaration of Independence, certain passages from it. We'll get to that in a second. But at the end of every chapter, there are questions to further the debate. Can you spend some time on that and tell us how those questions were formulated? What were the guidelines?
So our hope is that the book would be a kind of model for conversations, that it's not just a book you read and then put down, but that it's a book that actually opens up real conversation, not just on the pages of the book, but actually in real life, that Israelis and Americans can use the material in the book to build actual real-life conversations, maybe using the kind of discussion questions that the book provides, or maybe their own. But I think that there's a feeling of isolation on both sides, and that's part of what the book is trying to combat, at least in mean, I can speak obviously more authentically about North America, but I think that many liberal/progressive, whatever word you want to use, Jews find themselves, even though we're actually the majority, more and more isolated, in particular around conversations that have to do with Israel. And from what I see here, there is this sort of gap also on this side where even the people who would sort of naturally be our dialogue partners don't even necessarily know that these conversations exist in North America, because I think what's being portrayed in terms of here in Israel, in terms of the reality on the ground in North America, is that there's this gap between the sort of, for lack of a better term, I'll say right wing. I mean, that's such a kind of oversimplistic term, but the Jews who support, anything that Israel does right or wrong, who sort of, Sheldon Adelson types and, that make it very difficult to speak out publicly against policies of the Israeli government. And then on the other hand, there's this sort of, especially among young people, this ever-growing kind of anti-occupation movement in which Israel can actually do nothing right, essentially, and where everything Israel does is suspect. So where, there is actually this binary which masks the reality that's really happening in North America. I mean, both those poles exist, of course, and they're both complicated in different ways. But between that, there's this whole kind of world of progressive Jews who are deeply connected to Israel, even as they may criticize.
That used to be the epicenter of North American Jewish politics, right? This kind of, the group in between. But what we're saying, these two poles that have been growing, have been eating into that center ground. And in a way, you can look at it, like put a positive spin on it and say, well, actually, they're showing a form of engagement with Israel. Whether you like it or not, it's a different thing. But, I mean, when you're promoting pluralism, which you clearly are doing and saying it out loud, this is, two things that you should welcome, though, in a way, polemicize with, perhaps. But still, on the whole, welcome them.
Yeah, absolutely. I do believe, I may be in the minority, but I do believe that there's a lot of shrying in the United States about, our young people, and they're so anti-Israel. I actually hate the terms pro-Israel and anti-Israel, because I think that they just sort of oversimplify the whole situation and mask what's really behind the stances that people take. So I agree with you that, let's say, our young people, quote unquote, okay, who are anti-occupation and are so highly critical of Israel and, stage sit-downs against Israel and so on, they're incredibly engaged with Israel, actually, right? And there is some energy there to harness. And by the way, a lot of people talk about that younger generation as them, and they're not them, they're us. They're our children. In fact, sometimes they're literally our children. They are leaders of our youth movements. They are, in many ways, the kind of the best and the brightest, in some cases, of who we are.
So maybe it is a natural progression of what progressive Jewish politics in North America is. You can say that the crisis of liberal Zionism in America derives from the fact that what's been so tenable for so long is perhaps not that tenable anymore, and you cannot fully support Israel while fully opposing the occupation when history shows that the two have, converging more and more. Israel and the occupation, especially in the last 10 years of Netanyahu, to a large extent, the occupation has become the centerpiece of Israel's foreign policy.
Yeah, certainly there's something to be said for that. But I do think that there is a very important middle ground that has to do with connecting North American Jews who want to still engage with Israel in positive ways, despite all of the criticisms, which are real and very important. It's not a matter of wanting to just reject the relationship with Israel, right? There's a desire to connect here with Israelis with whom we share those values. And we know, I mean, obviously they exist, right?
Yeah.
Like Israel's non-monolith the way the North American community isn't. And so for us as the Reform movement, we find a lot of those connections through the Israeli Reform movement. So, I mean, for me personally, through my Israeli colleagues here who are doing such important work on the ground that has to do with pluralism, with democracy, with, rights for all and that kind of work that's so critical and so connected to the work we do in North America.
But doesn't the occupation spoil the broth? What would you say to a young congregant who comes to you and says, okay, I've been listening to what you're saying. I really, really appreciate this stance. I want to be neither that pole nor the other. I want to be the middle ground, being pro-Israel, whatever you want to call it, and be critical when it happens. And then I've started looking into Israel, see what it's all about. There are many, many things that are going on, many good things going on there. I've been reading the right publications. I've been following the right NGOs, the ones that you recommended. But still, when I read the news, I always see the occupation, what's happening to the Palestinians in times of military campaigns. I mean, just look at Gaza. I mean, there's something that, what would you say to someone who says, I've really tried, but it doesn't add up?
So I think, to me, it's about criticizing Israel and being honest in terms of your, one's own beliefs and values, which probably would include what you're talking about, but also not demonizing Israelis as a whole, because there are so many Israelis who would agree with that and who are doing the actual work on the ground, some kind of collaborative project with Palestinians, or, I mean, I don't want to start naming different projects. There are so many things going on, but there are Israelis who are doing the actual things that we would want Israel doing, but that's not what we hear about in the newspapers, right? That's not, what the government is doing, but it doesn't mean that's not what the people are doing, right? And there are many Israelis here who are in a lot of pain about what their own country is doing in terms of the occupation. And I think that's a really important connection to make. But also, there's a nuance here about what it means, what occupation means here that I don't think is necessarily understood in North America, like the complexity of the situation.
Do you think that at some point in the past, or maybe still, your partners in Israel have felt neglected or abandoned by progressive American Jews?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we don't want them to feel abandoned. I mean, those are our partners.
Yeah.
And we have to be partners for each other. I think that there are important lessons that we need to learn from progressive Israelis, and there are things that progressive Israelis need to learn from us, and we need to be in conversation with each other. Absolutely.
What would you say are the most important things that they need to learn from each other? One for each, or more.
Oh, my gosh. If I knew exactly what it was, I could solve the problem, right? Perhaps. Sure. First of all, I mean, I think that the first thing that's important is just to know that each side exists, right? Because I think that that's part of the problem, that there's this big gap of visibility, right? It's so easy to demonize, or it's so easy to feel, I mean, I think for many Israelis, there's a sense of being abandoned by the American Jewish community. And I think it's important for us to show that that's not at all the case, that we actually really care about the fight that is being fought here by progressives, right? Whether it's about occupation, whether it's about social issues within Israel.
Do you think this is new, or has it been something that really was in the background of Jewish American Israeli relationship throughout the years?
I think that it's gotten sort of covered up by the big, like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and the sense that American Jews are just so happy about this. Without understanding that actually the majority of Jews either don't understand the implications of it or are not happy with it. That it's really a very specific slice of the American Jewish community that supports that, and that supports the policies of our American government in making such a move happen. So I think there's just such a big misunderstanding.
Right. And what do American Jews what can they learn from Israel, from their Israeli counterparts?
Right.
The tenacity, The perseverance or other things?
Well, in some ways, I think it's the same thing. Like, there needs to be a visibility of the social justice work that's going on here on a daily basis. What is the actual grassroots work going on? The attempts to push back against occupation, the attempts to humanize people who are being dehumanized. That work is happening in such important ways, but it doesn't have visibility.
I want to spend some time on the Declaration of Independence, which is a key text in the book. Many of the chapters are an engagement with different passages in it. Why the Declaration of Independence particularly? It doesn't really have any legal status in Israel. There's a huge legal code of other things that are sometimes in contradiction or perhaps opposition of it. Why did you choose? What is really the value of the Declaration of Independence specifically in that sort of conversation you're wishing to stir?
I think it's symbolic. Sure, it doesn't have the legal standing, but it is the foundational text for this country. And we're rabbis, so we're text-based, right? We always start with a text. And so it seemed like, if Israel had a constitution, we might have used that, but then we might be having a very different conversation anyway.
Or not at all.
Or not at all, right. So, given that reality, it seemed like the Declaration of Independence, I think, speaks to the sort of original aspirations of the founding of this country, like what this country was supposed to be. Right. And that's true for any country, theoretically. And so we thought it was a way to look at the kind of aspirational Israel, like the Israel that the founders dreamed of and where we are today. And to talk about what that gap is, but how we can work toward that aspirational vision of Israel.
And when you put the two contributors of his chapter, the Israeli and the American, when you first read the manuscript, were you surprised by the similarities or were you taken aback by the dissimilarity? Was there more in common or less so than you expected?
I think both.
You're such a rabbi.
Right. I think every pairing was different. And I think some pairs worked better maybe than other pairs, or some pairs were sort of more simpatico from the start than other pairs. We tried to really get a wide range. So the Americans are not all rabbis, and they're not all Reform rabbis. We have one Orthodox rabbi, we have one conservative rabbi, and so on. And, the Israelis also are a diverse group of people, thought leaders, representatives of different communities.
Fewer rabbis, though, understandably.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And I thought the conversations were fascinating. Some people really reacted to each other and worked together, and some people didn't. So, every pairing was different.
Okay, let me rephrase the question. Did it make you more hopeful in the whole endeavor?
Yes. Well, I'm hopeful to begin with. That's partly just who I am by nature, but that's also why I love the idea of the book when it was suggested to me by Rabbi Stanley Davids to begin with. We bring a group of rabbis here every year. Why? Because to me, it's really important that our rabbis stay connected to Israel and stay sort of up to date on nuances in Israel, that it's not just about what they read in the press back home. And we do have many rabbis who come multiple times a year, but not every rabbi can do that. So we create these trips. And we meet with all kinds of people. It's not like all of our rabbis have to spend at least 1 year in Israel to begin with as part of school. So it's not, a welcome to Israel, here's Masada and the Dead Sea and whatever. But it's really...
It's not an upgraded birthright rate. Yeah.
Right. So we take them, and it's really about conversations. We meet all different kinds of community leaders and activists, depending on the theme of the trip. We really try to dig deep into conversation when we're here. So in some ways, I feel like this book is an outgrowth of that part of what we do, where we try to involve people in conversation and dialogue and to understand actual experiences and actual challenges, what makes this person's work important, complicated, dangerous, potentially, inspiring, and so on. And so the book, in some ways, works that same way.
You, at several points in this conversation, you've expressed your dismay at the label pro Israel. I would like to ask you to expand on it while perhaps thinking about what the nature of pro-Israeliness or the engagement of Americans with Israel would look like in the near future in America.
I'm going to start with that first part and maybe come back to the second
Please.
part. Okay, so I think that what's happening right now, at least in North America, is this kind of dismissiveness of ideas that challenge Israel, particularly the Israeli government or policies. So that if you present those challenges or if you are struggling with those challenges, you are labeled anti-Israel. And to me, defining pro-Israel as, supporting unequivocally anything Israeli or any policy is such an oversimplification. So I don't like those terms. I mean, to me, we should have a very wide tent in which a lot of different opinions are welcome and in which, to be critical of Israel, to be critical of occupation, or to be critical of other things that don't even have to do with occupation, like, the lack of pluralism, the way Reform Rabbis are treated in Israel, et cetera, the whole Kotel situation. That doesn't mean you're anti-Israel. It actually means you may be extremely engaged with Israel. You love Israel. You care about Israel's future and Israel's people. And you want Israel to be something better. I mean, in some ways, it goes back to the Declaration of Independence. Like, you want Israel to be that aspirational vision of equality and tolerance and, a sort of wide, diverse nation that lives in peace, right?
Right. Well, Ashrei HaMa'amin is what I have to say to wrap up this conversation. Rabbi Hara Person, the Chief Executive of the Central Conference of American Rabbis and the publisher of the new book, Deepening the Dialogue, American Jews and Israelis Envision the Jewish Democratic State. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Please don't forget to rate us on iTunes and other podcasts app and visit our archives. They have more than 600 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. If you like what we do here, please like us on Facebook as well. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, as well as follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.